The thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the Mongolian steppes as dawn broke over the largest contiguous empire in human history, but the sounds that truly shaped this vast dominion weren't just the clash of swords or the crack of whips, they were the cries of conquest that emerged from the felt-lined jairs where the great Khan was building his legacy one brutal encounter at a time. Steam rose from the war camps scattered across the endless grasslands, where victory celebrations had transformed into systematic campaigns of sexual domination that would reshape the genetic makeup of entire continents. This wasn't just military conquest. This wasn't even simple pillaging. Under Genghis Khan's rule, the Mongol Empire developed sexual practices so extreme, so calculated, and so effective that they became weapons of war more powerful than any siege engine or cavalry charge. The Khan didn't just conquer territory, it conquered bloodlines, transforming human reproduction into imperial policy and sexual violence into statecraft. From the breeding programs that created armies of half-Mongol children to the systematic sexual slavery that populated his mobile cities, we're about to explore how one man's bizarre appetites became the foundation for an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary. These weren't random acts of barbarity but carefully orchestrated strategies that used sexuality to bind conquered peoples to Mongol rule while ensuring the genetic dominance of the Khan's lineage. Before we ride into this storm of conquest and desire, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into history's most shocking revelations. Now prepare yourself, the war drums are beating, the Mara's milk is fermenting, and across these endless steppes, the great Khan is about to reveal how he used sexuality to conquer the world. The great Khan's genetic empire. Genghis Khan didn't just build an empire through military conquest, created a genetic dynasty that would spread his DNA across 2 continents through sexual practices that were as systematic and strategic as any military campaign. Modern genetic studies suggest that nearly 16 million men alive today carry genetic markers that trace back to the great Khan, making him perhaps the most reproductively successful human being in recorded history. The scale of Genghis Khan's reproductive activities defied comprehension even by the standards of his time. Historical accounts suggest he maintained a primary harem of over 500 women, with secondary harems scattered across his empire that housed thousands more. But these weren't just collections of beautiful women, they were carefully curated breeding programs designed to produce offspring who would carry Mongol genetic traits while binding conquered populations to the Khan's rule. The selection process for the Khan's harems was as methodical as military recruitment. Mongol commanders were instructed to identify the most beautiful and intelligent women in conquered territories, with specific preferences for certain physical characteristics that the Khan believed would produce superior offspring. Height, bone structure, skin tone, and even hair texture were evaluated according to criteria that combined aesthetic preference with primitive genetic theory. The organization of these harems was remarkably sophisticated, with elaborate hierarchies that reflected both the Khan's personal preferences and the political importance of different conquered territories. Women from defeated royal families held the highest positions, their noble blood making their children valuable political assets who could legitimize Mongol rule in their homelands. The Khan's sexual schedule was planned with military precision, with court officials maintaining detailed calendars that ensured optimal reproductive timing while balancing political considerations. Different women were assigned specific days based on their fertility cycles, their political importance, and the Khan's strategic goals for different regions of his empire. The documentation of the Khan's reproductive activities was extensive and systematic. Mongol record keepers tracked pregnancies, births, and the characteristics of offspring with the same attention to detail they applied to military logistics. These records served both practical and political purposes, ensuring that the Khan's children could be identified and positioned appropriately within the imperial hierarchy. The medical support provided for the Khan's reproductive program was the most advanced available in the 13th century. Chinese physicians, Persian doctors, and traditional Mongol healers worked together to maximize fertility, ensure healthy pregnancies, and optimize the genetic potential of the Khan's offspring through dietary regimens, herbal treatments, and primitive forms of prenatal care. The political implications of the Khan's reproductive strategy were profound and far-reaching. By fathering children with women from conquered territories, he created genetic bonds that made rebellion against Mongol rule equivalent to rebellion against one's own family. His offspring served as living symbols of Mongol dominance while providing local populations with genetic stakes in the empire's success. The economic resources devoted to supporting the Khan's reproductive activities were enormous. Entire administrative departments were dedicated to managing his harems, supporting pregnant women, and raising his children. The cost of maintaining thousands of women and their offspring required tribute from across the empire and represented one of the largest budget items in Mongol imperial finances. The psychological impact of the Khan's reproductive dominance on conquered populations was devastating and deliberate. The systematic impregnation of local women served as a form of genetic colonization that demonstrated Mongol power in the most intimate and personal way possible. Resistance became not just politically dangerous but genetically futile. The international scope of the Khan's reproductive activities created genetic networks that spanned continents. His children were born in territories from China to Eastern Europe, creating a genetic diaspora that would influence the development of dozens of cultures and civilizations for centuries to come. The religious and cultural adaptations that the Khan made to accommodate his reproductive program revealed the flexibility and pragmatism that characterized Mongol rule. He adopted local marriage customs, religious ceremonies, and cultural practices that would make his sexual relationships more acceptable to conquered populations while maintaining his own cultural identity. The mobile cities of desire. The Mongol Empire wasn't just a military force, it was a massive mobile civilization that carried its sexual culture across continents in wagon trains that stretched for hundreds of miles. These moving cities weren't just supply lines but elaborate sexual ecosystems that included harems, breeding programs, and entertainment complexes that made the Khan's camps more like traveling pleasure palaces than military installations. The logistics of moving thousands of women and children across the steppes required innovations in transportation, organization, and resource management that rivaled any military achievement. Specialized wagons were designed to house pregnant women, nursing mothers, and young children, while elaborate tent systems provided privacy and comfort for the Khan's sexual activities even during active military campaigns. The organization of these mobile harems was as complex as any government bureaucracy. Women were assigned to different wagon trains based on their status, their stage of pregnancy, and their relationship to the Khan. Senior wives supervised junior concubines, while eunuch administrators managed the logistics of feeding, housing, and protecting thousands of women during constant travel. The security arrangements for the Khan's mobile harems were extensive and sophisticated. Elite guard units were assigned specifically to protect the women and children, while elaborate protocols governed who could approach the harem wagons and under what circumstances. The safety of the Khan's reproductive assets was considered as important as protecting his military supplies. The cultural diversity within these mobile harems was staggering. Women from dozens of different ethnic groups, speaking different languages and practicing different religions, were forced to coexist in the confined spaces of wagon trains. This created unique cultural fusion that influenced everything from cuisine and clothing to religious practices and artistic expression. The medical care provided during these mobile campaigns was remarkably advanced for its time. Traveling physicians maintained portable hospitals that could handle everything from routine pregnancies to complex medical emergencies. The Khan's concern for his reproductive program ensured that his women received better medical care than most nobles in settled civilizations. The economic impact of these mobile harems was enormous. The cost of feeding, clothing, and housing thousands of women and children during constant travel required tribute from across the empire. Entire regions were assigned the responsibility of supporting different segments of the Khan's mobile reproductive program. The psychological effects of constant travel on the women in these mobile harems must have been profound. They were cut off from their families and homelands, forced to live in cramped conditions with women from enemy cultures, and required to bear children for a man who represented the destruction of everything they had known. The technological innovations that emerged from managing these mobile harems influenced the development of Mongol military and civilian technology. Improvements in wagon design, tent construction, and portable equipment that were developed for the harems were later applied to military logistics and civilian transportation. The communication systems that connected these mobile harems to the broader empire were sophisticated and efficient. The Khan maintained regular contact with his traveling women through messenger networks that could coordinate reproductive schedules, medical care, and resource allocation across thousands of miles. The environmental impact of these massive mobile harems was significant. The movement of thousands of people and animals across the steppes required careful management of grazing rights, water sources, and waste disposal. The Mongols developed sustainable practices that allowed these massive populations to move across the landscape without destroying the resources they depended on. The social hierarchies that developed within these mobile harems reflected both Mongol cultural values and the practical necessities of managing diverse populations during constant travel. Women who adapted successfully to nomadic life gained status and influence, while those who resisted or failed to integrate faced punishment or abandonment. The conquest breeding program's Genghis Khan didn't just defeat Armish, systematically impregnated the women of conquered peoples as part of a deliberate strategy to create hybrid populations that would be genetically and culturally bound to Mongol rule. These weren't random acts of sexual violence but carefully planned breeding programs that used human reproduction as a tool of imperial control. The immediate aftermath of Mongol victories included organized sexual campaigns that were as systematic as any military operation. Mongol commanders received specific instructions about which women to capture, how to evaluate their breeding potential, and what procedures to follow for integrating them into the Khan's reproductive program. The criteria for selecting women for these breeding programs were detailed and specific. Mongol officers were trained to identify physical characteristics that indicated good health, fertility, and genetic compatibility with Mongol traits. Intelligence, beauty, and social status were also considered, but reproductive potential was the primary concern. The processing of captured women was conducted with military efficiency. Medical examinations determined fertility and health status, while interrogations established family background and social position. Women who met the breeding program criteria were marked for transportation to the Khan's harems, while others were distributed among Mongol officers or sold into slavery. The psychological conditioning of captured women was as important as their physical preparation. Mongol handlers used a combination of rewards and punishments to break down resistance and create compliance with their new roles as breeding stock. Women who accepted their situation quickly received better treatment, while those who resisted faced harsh consequences. The integration of captured women into existing harem structures required careful management to prevent conflicts and maintain order. New arrivals were assigned to experienced women who could teach them Mongol customs and expectations, while gradual introduction to the Khan's presence allowed for assessment of their suitability for his personal attention. The medical care provided to women in the breeding programs was focused primarily on maximizing their reproductive potential. Diets were adjusted to enhance fertility, herbal treatments were administered to regulate menstrual cycles, and physical conditioning programs were designed to ensure healthy pregnancies and deliveries. The documentation of breeding program activities was extensive and detailed. Records tracked which women had been captured from which territories, their reproductive history, and the characteristics of their offspring. This information was used to evaluate the success of different breeding strategies and to plan future reproductive campaigns. The political implications of these breeding programs extended far beyond simple population control. The children produced through these programs served as living bonds between conquered peoples and Mongol rule, making rebellion equivalent to abandoning one's own offspring and grandchildren. The economic resources devoted to these breeding programs were substantial. The cost of capturing, transporting, housing, and maintaining thousands of women required significant investment, but the Mongols viewed this as essential infrastructure for long-term imperial control. The cultural impact of these breeding programs was profound and lasting. The hybrid populations they created developed unique cultural identities that combined Mongol and local traditions, creating new ethnic groups that would influence the development of entire regions for centuries to come. The genetic legacy of these breeding programs is still visible today. Population genetic studies have identified Mongol genetic markers in populations across Asia and Eastern Europe, providing scientific evidence of the scale and effectiveness of the Khan's reproductive strategies. The shamanic sex rituals Genghis Khan didn't just conquer through military might, weaponized the spiritual traditions of the Mongol steppes, transforming ancient shamanic rituals into elaborate sexual ceremonies that combined religious devotion with reproductive strategy. These weren't just personal spiritual practices but state-sponsored rituals that used sexuality to communicate with the spirit world and ensure divine favor for the empire. The traditional Mongol shamanic belief system included elaborate sexual rituals that were believed to channel spiritual energy and ensure fertility for both humans and livestock. The Khan adapted these ancient practices to serve his imperial ambitions, creating ceremonies that combined traditional spirituality with his personal reproductive goals. The timing of these shamanic sex rituals was determined by complex astronomical calculations that combined traditional Mongol calendar systems with Chinese astrological knowledge. Specific sexual activities were scheduled to coincide with favorable celestial events that were believed to maximize both spiritual power and reproductive success. The participants in these rituals included not just the Khan and his chosen partners but also shamanic priests, court officials, and selected witnesses who served both spiritual and political functions. These ceremonies weren't private affairs but elaborate state functions that demonstrated the Khan's connection to the spirit world. The preparation for shamanic sex rituals was extensive and elaborate. Participants underwent purification ceremonies that included fasting, ritual bathing, and consumption of hallucinogenic substances that were believed to enhance spiritual receptivity. The Khan's partners were specially prepared through dietary regimens and spiritual conditioning that could last for weeks. The locations chosen for these rituals were carefully selected based on their spiritual significance and practical considerations. Sacred sites on the steppes, mountain peaks, and river confluences were preferred, but portable ritual spaces could be created during military campaigns using elaborate tent systems and sacred objects. The ritual objects used in these ceremonies were crafted from materials that held special spiritual significance in Mongol culture. Silver vessels, jade ornaments, and items made from the bones and hides of sacred animals were arranged in specific patterns that were believed to channel spiritual energy and ensure divine favor. The sexual activities that formed the core of these rituals were prescribed by ancient traditions that specified particular positions, timing, and procedures that were believed to maximize both spiritual and reproductive benefits. These weren't spontaneous encounters but carefully choreographed ceremonies that followed precise spiritual protocols. The documentation of these rituals was handled by shamanic priests who maintained oral traditions and secret written records that preserved the spiritual knowledge necessary for conducting effective ceremonies. This information was considered so sacred and powerful that access was restricted to the highest levels of Mongol society. The political implications of these shamanic sex rituals were significant. They provided religious justification for the Khan's sexual activities while demonstrating his unique connection to the spirit world. Participation in these ceremonies became a mark of special favor that elevated chosen women above the general population of the harems. The psychological impact of these rituals on participants was profound. The combination of spiritual preparation, hallucinogenic substances, and elaborate ceremony created intense experiences that could produce lasting psychological bonds between the Khan and his partners while reinforcing their belief in his divine authority. The cultural influence of these shamanic sex rituals extended throughout the Mongol Empire as conquered peoples were exposed to these practices and sometimes required to participate in them. This created cultural fusion that influenced the development of religious and sexual practices across multiple civilizations. The medical knowledge that was incorporated into these rituals included sophisticated understanding of human reproduction, herbal medicine, and psychological manipulation that was remarkably advanced for its time. Shamanic priests served as both spiritual guides and medical advisors who could enhance both the spiritual and physical aspects of these ceremonies. The diplomatic marriage weapons Genghis Khan transformed marriage from a personal union into a weapon of imperial expansion, using matrimonial alliances to conquer territories without bloodshed while creating networks of sexual and political obligation that bound conquered peoples to Mongol rule. These weren't traditional diplomatic marriages but systematic campaigns that used sexuality to achieve military objectives. The Khan's approach to diplomatic marriage was revolutionary in its scope and systematic nature. Rather than arranging occasional marriages for political advantage, he created a comprehensive marriage strategy that targeted specific kingdoms and tribal groups with multiple simultaneous matrimonial campaigns designed to create overlapping networks of obligation and control. The selection of marriage targets was based on careful intelligence gathering that evaluated not just the political value of potential alliances but also the reproductive potential of proposed brides and the genetic advantages that different unions might provide. Military scouts doubled as marriage brokers who assessed both the strategic value and sexual appeal of potential partners. The negotiation of these diplomatic marriages often involved complex exchanges that went far beyond traditional dowries and territorial agreements. The Khan would offer military protection, trade advantages, and political autonomy in exchange for marriage rights that included not just the primary bride but also her female relatives and servants. The ceremonies that formalized these diplomatic marriages were elaborate affairs that combined Mongol traditions with local customs to create hybrid rituals that satisfied both cultures while establishing clear hierarchies that favored Mongol interests. These weren't just weddings but political theater designed to demonstrate Mongol power and cultural adaptability. The consummation of diplomatic marriages was often witnessed by representatives of both parties to ensure that the political alliance had been properly sealed through physical union. These witnesses served as guarantors of the marriage's validity and could provide testimony in future disputes about the terms of the alliance. The ongoing management of diplomatic marriages required sophisticated administrative systems that tracked the political and reproductive obligations of multiple wives while maintaining relationships with their families and home territories. The Khan's diplomatic wives served as ongoing ambassadors who could influence their relatives' loyalty to Mongol rule. The children produced through diplomatic marriages were carefully positioned within the imperial hierarchy to maximize their political value. These offspring served as living symbols of the alliance between their parents' peoples while providing the Khan with potential heirs who could legitimately rule over their mother's territories. The economic implications of the Khan's diplomatic marriage strategy were substantial. The cost of maintaining multiple wives from different cultures, supporting their households, and honoring the financial obligations of marriage contracts required significant resources, but the political benefits often exceeded the costs. The military advantages gained through diplomatic marriages were significant and immediate. Allied territories provided troops, supplies, and strategic bases that enhanced Mongol military capabilities while reducing the need for costly military campaigns. Marriage became a form of conquest that was often more effective than warfare. The cultural impact of these diplomatic marriages created unique fusion cultures that combined Mongol and local traditions in ways that influenced the development of entire regions. The Khan's diplomatic wives served as cultural bridges who facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions between different civilizations. The intelligence networks that developed around diplomatic marriages provided the Khan with valuable information about potential enemies and opportunities. His wives served as sources of political intelligence who could provide insights into the internal affairs of their home territories and neighboring regions. The psychological warfare aspects of diplomatic marriage were as important as their practical benefits. The systematic marriage of local noblewomen demonstrated Mongol power in the most personal way possible while creating genetic and emotional bonds that made resistance to Mongol rule equivalent to betraying one's own family. The concubine armies Genghis Khan didn't just maintain harem, she created military units composed entirely of women who served as both sexual partners and auxiliary forces that provided essential support for his campaigns. These concubine armies weren't just camp followers but organized military formations that played crucial roles in Mongol conquest and administration. The organization of these concubine armies was based on military principles that divided women into units based on their skills, origins, and relationship to the Khan. Senior concubines served as officers who commanded groups of junior women, while specialized units were created for different functions including intelligence gathering, medical care, and cultural liaison. The training provided to members of concubine armies was comprehensive and sophisticated. Women learned not just sexual techniques but also military skills including horsemanship, archery, and hand-to-hand combat. Many became proficient warriors who could defend themselves and support military operations when necessary. The equipment and supplies provided to concubine armies were of high quality and included specialized gear designed for their unique roles. Weapons, armor, and horses were provided to women who demonstrated military aptitude, while medical supplies and communication equipment supported their auxiliary functions. The tactical deployment of concubine armies was carefully planned to maximize their effectiveness in supporting military campaigns. Different units were assigned to specific roles including reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, medical support, and cultural negotiation with conquered populations. The intelligence functions performed by concubine armies were particularly valuable. Women could often gain access to information that was unavailable to male spies, while their cultural backgrounds allowed them to understand and interpret local customs and political dynamics that might be missed by Mongol commanders. The medical services provided by concubine armies were essential for maintaining the health and effectiveness of Mongol forces. Women with medical training served as field surgeons, herbalists, and midwives who could treat everything from battle wounds to reproductive health issues. The cultural liaison functions performed by concubine armies helped smooth the integration of conquered territories into the Mongol Empire. Women who shared cultural backgrounds with conquered peoples could serve as interpreters, negotiators, and cultural bridges who facilitated cooperation and reduced resistance. The economic activities of concubine armies included managing the logistics of military campaigns, organizing trade relationships with local populations, and administering the collection of tribute and taxes. These women often possessed commercial skills that were valuable for imperial administration. The communication networks maintained by concubine armies were sophisticated and efficient. Women served as messengers who could travel between different parts of the empire while maintaining the extensive correspondence necessary for coordinating military and administrative activities across vast distances. The psychological warfare capabilities of concubine armies were significant and effective. The presence of organized female military units demonstrated Mongol power while challenging traditional gender roles in ways that could demoralize enemy forces and impress potential allies. The technological innovations that emerged from equipping and organizing concubine armies influenced the development of Mongol military technology. Specialized equipment designed for female warriors led to improvements in armor design, weapon manufacturing, and military logistics that benefited the entire Mongol military system. The legacy of these concubine armies extended beyond their immediate military functions to influence the development of women's roles in Mongol society and the societies they conquered. The precedent of women serving in military and administrative roles created opportunities for female leadership that persisted long after the Khan's death. The genetic colonization strategy. Genghis Khan pioneered a form of colonization that went beyond territorial conquest to include systematic genetic transformation of conquered populations. This wasn't just random sexual violence but a calculated strategy designed to create hybrid populations that would be biologically and culturally bound to Mongol rule while gradually replacing local genetic lineages with Mongol DNA. The theoretical foundation for this genetic colonization strategy was based on Mongol beliefs about the inheritance of character traits and the importance of bloodlines in determining loyalty and capability. The Khan believed that children who carried Mongol genetic heritage would naturally be more loyal to Mongol rule and more capable of serving imperial interests. The implementation of genetic colonization required systematic programs that went far beyond the Khan's personal reproductive activities to include organized breeding programs involving thousands of Mongol warriors and administrators. Every level of Mongol society was encouraged to participate in the genetic transformation of conquered territories. The scale of these genetic colonization efforts was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that Mongol forces systematically impregnated hundreds of thousands of women across their empire, creating hybrid populations that would carry Mongol genetic markers for generations. This represented one of the largest genetic engineering projects in human history. The documentation of genetic colonization activities was extensive and systematic. Mongol administrators maintained detailed records of breeding programs, tracked the characteristics of hybrid offspring, and monitored the genetic transformation of conquered populations with the same attention they devoted to military logistics. The medical support provided for genetic colonization programs included sophisticated understanding of human reproduction and inheritance that was remarkably advanced for its time. Mongol physicians developed techniques for maximizing fertility, ensuring healthy pregnancies, and optimizing the genetic potential of hybrid offspring. The political implications of genetic colonization were profound and lasting. The creation of hybrid populations that carried Mongol genetic heritage made rebellion against Mongol rule equivalent to genetic self-destruction, while providing the empire with populations that had biological stakes in its continued success. The economic resources devoted to genetic colonization were enormous. The cost of supporting pregnant women, raising hybrid children, and maintaining the administrative systems necessary for managing these programs required tribute from across the empire and represented a major investment in long-term imperial control. The cultural impact of genetic colonization created unique fusion cultures that combined Mongol and local traditions in ways that influenced the development of entire civilizations. These hybrid populations developed new languages, religious practices, and social systems that reflected their mixed heritage. The psychological effects of genetic colonization on conquered populations were devastating and deliberate. The systematic replacement of local genetic lineages with Mongol DNA served as a form of biological conquest that was more thorough and permanent than any military victory. The international scope of genetic colonization created genetic networks that spanned continents and influenced the development of dozens of different cultures. The Mongol genetic legacy is still visible today in populations from Korea to Eastern Europe, providing scientific evidence of the scale and effectiveness of these programs. The technological innovations that emerged from managing genetic colonization programs influenced the development of Mongol administrative and medical systems. Techniques for tracking genetic inheritance, managing large populations, and optimizing reproductive outcomes were applied to other aspects of imperial administration. The environmental impact of genetic colonization was significant, as the creation of large hybrid populations required careful management of resources and settlement patterns. The Mongols developed sustainable practices that allowed these expanded populations to thrive without destroying the ecological systems they depended on. The sacred sexuality of power. Genghis Khan transformed sexuality from a private human experience into a sacred expression of imperial power, creating religious and cultural frameworks that justified his extreme sexual practices while elevating them to the level of divine mandate. This wasn't just personal indulgence but systematic theology that made sexual dominance equivalent to spiritual authority. The religious justification for the Khan's sexual practices was based on traditional Mongol beliefs about the divine nature of leadership and the spiritual significance of reproduction. Mongol shamanic traditions included concepts of sacred sexuality that the Khan adapted and expanded to justify his unprecedented reproductive activities. The development of imperial sexual theology required the collaboration of shamanic priests, Chinese scholars, and Islamic theologians who worked together to create religious frameworks that could accommodate the Khan's sexual practices while maintaining their legitimacy within different cultural traditions. The ceremonial aspects of imperial sexuality were elaborate and sophisticated. The Khan's sexual activities were surrounded by religious rituals that emphasized their spiritual significance while creating theatrical spectacles that demonstrated his divine authority to both participants and observers. The symbolic meanings attributed to different sexual practices were complex and multilayered. Specific sexual positions, timing, and procedures were believed to channel different types of spiritual energy while communicating with various deities and ancestral spirits that protected the empire. The training of religious officials who supported imperial sexuality was extensive and specialized. Shamanic priests learned to conduct sexual rituals, while court scholars developed theological justifications for practices that might otherwise be considered violations of religious law. The documentation of sacred sexuality practices was handled by religious authorities who maintained both public records that emphasized the spiritual aspects of imperial sexuality and secret texts that preserved the detailed knowledge necessary for conducting effective sexual rituals. The political implications of sacred sexuality were significant and far-reaching. The religious justification for the Khan's sexual practices provided legitimacy for his rule while creating theological precedents that could be used to justify the sexual activities of his successors and subordinates. The psychological impact of sacred sexuality on participants was profound and lasting. The combination of religious preparation, ceremonial context, and spiritual interpretation created intense experiences that could produce lasting psychological bonds while reinforcing belief in the Khan's divine authority. The cultural influence of sacred sexuality extended throughout the Mongol Empire as conquered peoples were exposed to these practices and sometimes required to participate in them. This created cultural fusion that influenced the development of religious and sexual practices across multiple civilizations. The medical knowledge that was incorporated into sacred sexuality practices included sophisticated understanding of human reproduction, herbal medicine, and psychological manipulation that was remarkably advanced for its time. Religious practitioners served as both spiritual guides and medical advisors. The artistic and literary expressions of sacred sexuality influenced the development of Mongol culture and the cultures they conquered. Poems, songs, and visual art that celebrated imperial sexuality created new aesthetic traditions that combined spiritual and erotic themes in unprecedented ways. The legacy of sacred sexuality practices extended beyond the Mongol Empire to influence the development of sexual and religious practices in many of the civilizations they conquered. The precedent of combining political power with sexual authority created patterns that would influence the development of imperial systems for centuries to come. The eternal conquest as we stand today on the windswept steppes where Genghis Khan once raised his banners, gazing across grasslands that still echo with the thunder of Mongol horses, we're confronted with the uncomfortable reality that history's largest contiguous empire was built not just on military genius but on sexual practices so extreme and systematic that they challenge our understanding of both conquest and human nature. Genghis Khan didn't just defeat Armish conquered the very concept of human reproduction, transforming sexuality from a private human experience into a weapon of imperial expansion that was more effective than any siege engine or cavalry charge. His sexual practices weren't random acts of barbarity but calculated strategies that used human desire and reproduction to bind conquered peoples to Mongol rule in ways that made resistance equivalent to genetic suicide. The scale of the Khan's reproductive activities defies modern comprehension. The genetic evidence suggests that his systematic breeding programs were so successful that nearly 1 in every 200 men alive today carries genetic markers that trace back to his lineage. This represents perhaps the most successful reproductive strategy in human history, a genetic conquest that continues to expand centuries after the empire that created it has crumbled to dust. But the true horror of the Khan's sexual empire wasn't just its scale but its systematic nature. This wasn't the random violence of barbarian raiders but the calculated policy of a sophisticated civilization that had weaponized human sexuality with scientific precision. The Mongols created administrative systems, religious justifications, and cultural frameworks that transformed sexual violence into statecraft and reproductive coercion into imperial policy. The psychological impact of living under such a system must have been devastating beyond imagination. Conquered peoples faced not just political subjugation but genetic colonization that threatened their very identity as distinct peoples. The Khan's sexual practices created a form of biological imperialism that was more thorough and permanent than any military conquest. Yet the Mongol sexual system also created opportunities for cultural exchange and genetic diversity that influenced the development of entire civilizations. The hybrid populations that emerged from the Khan's breeding programs developed unique cultures that combined traditions from across the known world, creating new forms of art, literature, and social organization that enriched human civilization. The religious and cultural adaptations that the Mongols made to accommodate their sexual practices revealed a pragmatic flexibility that was characteristic of their entire imperial system. They absorbed and adapted the best elements of every culture they encountered while maintaining their own core identity and values. The technological and administrative innovations that emerged from managing the Khan's vast sexual empire influenced the development of imperial systems throughout the medieval world. Techniques for managing large populations, coordinating complex logistics, and maintaining communication across vast distances were refined through the necessities of managing thousands of women and children across continents. The economic impact of the Mongol sexual system was enormous, requiring resources and administrative capacity that rivaled the costs of maintaining their military forces. The investment in reproductive infrastructure represented a long-term strategy that prioritized genetic and cultural conquest over immediate military gains. The international implications of the Khan's sexual practices shaped the development of Eurasian civilization in ways that are still visible today. The genetic and cultural legacy of Mongol sexual colonization influenced the development of dozens of modern nations and ethnic groups across 2 continents. The documentation that the Mongols produced about their sexual practices provides modern historians with unprecedented insight into medieval attitudes toward sexuality, reproduction, and imperial power. These records reveal not just what people did but how they thought about the relationship between personal desire and political authority. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol example demonstrates how political systems can reshape the most fundamental aspects of human experience when they possess sufficient power and determination. The Khan's sexual empire shows how easily intimate human relationships can be transformed into tools of political control when privacy and consent are eliminated. The corruption and abuse that characterized much of the Mongol sexual system serves as a warning about the dangers of eliminating moral and legal constraints on political power. The Khan's example demonstrates how quickly sexual liberation can become sexual exploitation when it serves the interests of those in power. So tell us, which aspect of Genghis Khan's sexual empire disturbs you most? The systematic genetic colonization of conquered peoples, the transformation of women into military assets, or the way an entire civilization convinced itself that sexual violence was actually reproductive strategy? Share your thoughts below, and remember that understanding history's most extreme examples helps us recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time. If this journey into the heart of the Mongol sexual empire has shocked and fascinated you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration of how political systems have used sexuality as a tool of conquest throughout history. Until then, remember that the stories we tell here at Scandalous Pasts are fictional tales that may or may not be inspired by real events, but the lessons they teach about the relationship between power and human dignity are all too real. The winds still blow across the Mongolian steppes, carrying whispers of an empire that conquered the world not just through military might but through the systematic transformation of human sexuality into imperial policy. They remind us that power corrupts everything it touches, even the most intimate aspects of human experience, and that the line between liberation and exploitation disappears entirely when those in power convince themselves that their desires serve a greater good. In the endless grasslands where the great Khan once rode, we see not just the ghosts of ancient conquest but the eternal warning that human dignity is always fragile, that consent is always under assault by those who seek power over others, and that the most dangerous tyrants are those who convince themselves that their crimes are actually achievements.